The town watched her walk down the aisle to a man they called broken. But what secret forced a respected ranch woman into a marriage she never chose? Clara stood frozen inside the icy mountain church, her simple dress trembling in the cold air as Ethan Calloway's cane touched the wooden floor. Outside, the wind howled through the valley, and every whisper followed her toward the altar. She was leaving everything behind, but nobody knew the truth waiting beyond the mountain trail. Stay with us and discover the story. The wind came down from the San Juan Mountains like it had a mind of its own that morning. It pushed against the old wooden church in the small Colorado Territory settlement of Pine Hollow, rattling the windows and sending loose snow across the steps. The people gathered inside kept their coats on, their gloved hands folded, their voices lowered. Nobody was there to celebrate. They were there to see. At the front of the church stood Clara Whitmore. Her simple ivory dress was neat but plain, made from fabric that had been carefully chosen rather than proudly displayed. There was no lace-trimmed veil, no line of friends whispering excitedly around her, no father walking her down the aisle. Only Clara, standing alone beneath the faded wooden beams, while every eye in the room studied her. Some looked curious, some looked uncomfortable. A few looked away whenever she met their gaze. Clara had known this would happen. In a small frontier town, people always knew when something unusual was happening. They knew who lost a horse, who owed money at the general store, who was leaving for the mines, and who was marrying someone nobody expected. And nobody expected Clara Whitmore to marry Ethan Calloway, not the woman who had spent most of her life working behind the scenes at the Whitmore Ranch, not the woman who was rarely invited to dances because people considered her too serious, too quiet, and too different from the women men usually noticed, and certainly not the woman standing there today beside the name that had become almost a warning in the valley. Ethan Calloway, the mountain man, the wounded rancher, the man people whispered about when they thought nobody was listening. Clara looked toward the church doors as they opened. Cold air swept inside. Ethan stepped through. For a moment, the room went silent. He was taller than most men in Pine Hollow, wearing a dark wool coat over a plain work shirt. His beard was trimmed but not carefully shaped. His brown hair was touched by the mountain weather. A wooden cane rested firmly in his right hand, supporting the left leg that had never fully recovered after the accident years before. The old injury was obvious. People saw it before they saw anything else. That was how it had always been. But Clara noticed something different. She noticed the way Ethan paused before entering, allowing an elderly couple near the doorway to pass first. She noticed the way he removed his hat and greeted the preacher with a quiet nod. She noticed that he did not look embarrassed. He did not look angry. He simply looked tired. Not from the walk, from carrying something nobody else could see. Ethan walked slowly toward the front of the church. The wooden floor creaked beneath his boots. When he reached Clara, he stopped. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. This was the first time they had stood close enough to truly see each other. Clara had expected discomfort, maybe resentment. After all, this marriage had not been her idea. She had been told where she was going, who she was marrying, what she was expected to give up. But Ethan only looked at her with calm gray eyes. Then he quietly offered his hand, not grabbing, not demanding, just offering. Clara hesitated for half a second before placing her gloved hand in his. His hand was rough from years of work, warm despite the cold. The preacher cleared his throat. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his voice carrying through the small church. "We gather here today to witness the joining of Clara Whitmore and Ethan Calloway." The words sounded strange to Clara. A joining. That was what people called marriage, but standing there, she felt less like someone joining a life, and more like someone leaving one behind. Her eyes moved briefly toward the back of the church. Margaret Whitmore stood there. Clara's stepmother wore a dark blue coat with a fur collar and held herself with the same confidence she always carried. Beside her stood Lillian, beautiful, young, the kind of woman people noticed when she entered a room. Lillian's expression was difficult to read. She did not look happy. She did not look cruel either. Only uncertain. Clara looked away. She had spent years learning not to search for kindness where it rarely appeared. The ceremony continued. The preacher spoke of commitment and faith. Outside, the wind continued pressing against the church walls. When it came time for Ethan to speak, he looked at Clara. "I do," he said. His voice was low but steady. Then Clara heard her own voice answer. "I do," 2 words, that was all. A few minutes later, they were husband and wife. There was no cheering, no music, no celebration outside the church. Only quiet footsteps as people slowly began leaving. Clara stepped outside into the cold. Snow touched the shoulders of her dress. A wagon waited nearby. Ethan approached and reached for the small travel bag she carried. "I can carry it," Clara said. His hand stopped. "I know," the answer surprised her. Most men would have insisted, would have told her she should not carry heavy things, would have acted as though helping meant proving she could not do something herself. But Ethan simply nodded. "There's room in the wagon," he said. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she handed him the bag, not because she could not carry it, because for the first time in a long while, someone had offered help without making her feel small. They climbed into the wagon. The wheels rolled away from Pine Hollow. Behind them stood the Whitmore Ranch, the place Clara had known since childhood, the fences she repaired, the horses she raised, the ledgers she balanced late into the night, while everyone else slept. She watched the town disappear behind the falling snow. Ethan kept his eyes on the mountain road, the silence between them stretched. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. After several miles, Clara finally spoke. "How far is your ranch?" "About 3 hours." She nodded. "Do you live alone?" "Yes." The answer was simple. She looked ahead at the mountains rising in front of them. "And you agreed to this marriage?" Ethan held the reins loosely. "I did." "Why?" For the first time, he did not answer immediately. The wagon moved slowly over the frozen road. The horse's breath appeared in the cold air. Finally, Ethan said, "Because sometimes 2 people can understand what it feels like to be left behind." Clara looked at him, but Ethan was already watching the trail. She wanted to ask what he meant. She wanted to know if he pitied her, if he had agreed because nobody else wanted her. But something in his voice stopped her. There had been no pity there, only recognition, the kind that came from someone who knew loneliness personally. As evening approached, the road narrowed between tall pine trees. The mountains surrounded them on both sides, dark and endless beneath the winter sky. Clara pulled her coat tighter. She had left behind the only home she had ever known. She had no idea what waited ahead. A strange cabin, a strange husband, a life built far away from everyone she knew. Ethan guided the wagon higher into the mountains. Neither of them knew that the marriage arranged by someone else's cruelty would become the one thing neither of them expected. Neither knew that the quiet man beside her would be the first person to see Clara Whitmore as more than what others believed she was, and Clara did not yet know the truth. She had not been sent away because Ethan needed a wife. She had been sent away because someone wanted her gone. The mountains grew darker around them as the wagon disappeared into the snow-covered trail. And far behind them, at the Whitmore Ranch, a secret was waiting to be uncovered. 3 weeks earlier, before the church bells rang, and before Clara Whitmore stood beside Ethan Calloway beneath the cold wooden beams of Pine Hollow Chapel, the Whitmore Ranch had looked like it always had. The wide fields stretched beneath the Colorado sky. The cattle moved slowly across the winter pasture, their breath rising in pale clouds. The old barn doors creaked whenever the wind came down from the foothills, and the kitchen stove burned from morning until night. From the outside, it looked like a successful ranch. a place built on hard work, a place with a respected name. But inside the Whitmore house, not everyone carried the same weight. Clara knew that better than anyone. Before sunrise each morning, she was already awake. She checked the water barrels behind the kitchen, reviewed the cattle records, and walked the eastern fence line to see if the winter storms had damaged any posts. Her boots were usually covered in mud before most people in the house had finished their breakfast. The ranch hands respected her. They knew Clara understood the land. She knew which horses were restless before a storm. She knew when a cow was sick by the way it stood apart from the herd. She knew every payment owed by the ranch, and every expense written in the thick ledger kept inside her father's old office. But inside the house, her work was rarely mentioned. At the breakfast table, Margaret Whitmore poured coffee into Lillian's cup first. She always did. "Thomas Caldwell's family will be visiting next week," Margaret said, adjusting the silver spoon beside her own plate. "You should wear the blue dress." Lillian looked down at her hands. "Mother, I don't know if Thomas has decided anything." Margaret smiled. "Men like Thomas know what they want." Her eyes moved briefly toward Clara, and they usually want what looks right beside them. The room became quiet. Clara continued cutting her bread. She had learned long ago that silence was safer than arguing. Lillian looked uncomfortable. "Clara has been working harder than anyone here," she said softly. Margaret turned her head. "Working hard is not the same as being suitable." The words landed gently. That was always Margaret's way. She rarely raised her voice. She did not need to. A calm sentence from her could leave a deeper mark than an argument. Clara lowered her eyes toward her plate. She had heard those comparisons for years. Lillian had beauty. Lillian had charm. Lillian could walk into a room and make people remember her. Clara had calloused hands, a mind for numbers, and a habit of fixing problems before anyone knew they existed. Somehow, those things never seemed enough. Later that afternoon, Clara sat alone in the ranch office. The room smelled of old paper, leather, and wood smoke from the small iron stove in the corner. She opened the account book and carefully recorded the latest cattle sale. The receipt from the feed supplier was folded beside her. The numbers were not good. Winter had been harder than expected. Several repairs had cost more than planned. But Clara knew where they could save money. She knew which cattle should be sold before spring. She knew how to keep the ranch alive. A knock came at the door. She looked up. Margaret stood there. "Clara." Clara closed the ledger. "Yes," Margaret stepped inside and shut the door behind her. For a moment she said nothing. That alone made Clara uneasy. Margaret always had a purpose. "I heard you have been looking over the ranch accounts. I do that every week. You do more than that." Clara waited. Margaret walked slowly toward the desk. "You know Lillian's future depends on this family." Clara looked at her. "I know. Thomas Caldwell is interested in her." Clara said nothing. Thomas was the son of one of the wealthiest cattle owners in the territory. A marriage between the Caldwell and Whitmore families would bring influence, money, and security. At least that was what Margaret believed. "The Caldwell family expects certain things," Margaret continued. Clara's fingers rested on the edge of the desk. "What things?" Margaret looked directly at her. "A proper settlement." The room felt colder. Clara understood immediately. "My inheritance." Margaret did not deny it. "When your father died, he left arrangements that complicated things. My father left me a share of this ranch. Your father was an emotional man." Clara's expression changed slightly. She hated when Margaret spoke about him that way. He knew exactly what he was doing. Margaret sighed. "Clara, you need to be realistic." She reached into her coat pocket and placed a folded paper on the desk. Clara did not touch it. "What is that?" "An agreement." The answer was simple. Too simple. Clara slowly unfolded the paper. Her eyes moved across the words. She read it once, then again. Her face remained still, but her hand tightened around the edge of the document. It was a marriage agreement between Clara Whitmore and Ethan Calloway. For a moment, she thought she had misunderstood. Calloway? Margaret nodded. He has land, a cabin, a respectable name, even if he is no longer the man he once was. Clara looked up. You arranged this? I arranged an opportunity. No. The word came out quietly, but it was the first time Clara had refused her directly. Margaret's expression hardened. Think carefully. Clara placed the paper down. You want me to leave. I want you to have a future. No talk. Clara looked at the agreement again. You want Lillian to marry Thomas without complications. The silence that followed answered everything. Outside the window, a cold wind moved through the bare trees. Margaret folded her hands. You have always been practical, Clara. Do not suddenly become foolish. I worked this ranch for 15 years, and you were compensated. Clara stared at her. With what? Margaret did not answer. Because there was no answer. The long hours, the nights spent repairing records, the days riding through storms to check cattle. None of it had ever been considered enough. Margaret stepped closer. You are 31 years old. You know how people talk. Clara felt the familiar sting, but this time something inside her shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. You mean you know how people talk? Margaret's eyes narrowed. Be grateful someone is willing to marry you. The words hung in the room. Clara looked at the paper again. At Ethan Calloway's name. A man she had never met. A man who lived alone in the mountains. A man everyone in town described as broken. And suddenly, Clara understood. This was not about saving her. It was about removing her. Margaret picked up her gloves from the desk. You will have time to think. She walked toward the door, then stopped. Lillian deserves a chance at happiness. Clara looked toward the window. For years, she had carried responsibility for everyone around her. Maybe that was why people found it so easy to give her more. Margaret left. The door closed softly behind her. That evening, Clara walked through the ranch alone. She passed the barn where she had learned to ride, the fence post she repaired every spring, the old oak tree where her father used to sit and watch the sunset. She remembered his voice, not clearly, just enough. A reminder that once, someone had seen her differently. The next morning, Samuel Reed arrived at the ranch. The frontier lawyer had handled some of the Whitmore family's business for years. He removed his snow-covered coat and stood near the office door. Clara. She looked surprised. Mr. Reed. He glanced toward the house before lowering his voice. I need to speak with you about your father's documents. Clara frowned. My father's documents? Samuel nodded. There are things you were never shown. The winter wind moved across the ranch yard. Inside the house, Margaret watched from the window. And for the first time in years, Clara Whitmore was about to discover that the life she had been told she deserved was built on a lie. The words from Samuel Reed stayed with Clara long after the lawyer left. There are things you were never shown. She had heard those words before. Not exactly, but close enough. There had always been something missing when people spoke about her father's final days. Documents she never saw. Conversations she was not part of. Decisions made while she was busy keeping the ranch alive. Clara spent that evening in the office long after the lamps were lit. The small oil flame beside her ledger flickered whenever the wind slipped through the cracks around the window frame. Outside, the ranch settled into nighttime sounds. Horses shifted in the barn. A loose gate tapped softly against its post. She held the papers Samuel had given her. Not the entire file, not yet. He had told her there were records stored in his office in town. Records her father had prepared before his death. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Clara had asked him. Samuel had looked down at his gloves for the moment. Because I believed your stepmother had control over those papers. Clara had looked toward the Whitmore house, and now I believe someone needs to know the truth before signing anything. The agreement with Ethan Calloway sat beside her father's documents. 2 pieces of paper, 2 different futures. One was a marriage she had not asked for. The other was a truth she had spent years waiting to find. The next morning, Clara rode into Pine Hollow with Samuel. The road was hard from the overnight freeze. The wagon wheels bumped over frozen ruts, and the horses moved carefully along the narrow trail. Pine Hollow was already awake when they arrived. The general store had smoke rising from the chimney. The blacksmith's hammer rang from across the street. A few miners stood near the diner drinking coffee before heading toward the eastern hills. Samuel's office was above the general store. The stairs creaked beneath their boots. Inside, the room smelled of paper, dust, and old leather. Samuel removed several folders from a locked cabinet. Your father asked me to keep these safe. Clara looked at him. My father? Samuel nodded. He knew Margaret would not agree with his wishes. The first document was an old ranch agreement, then another, then a letter. Clara recognized the handwriting immediately, her father's. Her fingers paused before opening it. She had not seen his writing in years. The paper trembled slightly as she unfolded it. My dear Clara, if you are reading this, then I fear circumstances have prevented me from telling you what I intended. You have spent your life believing your work was simply expected of you. It was not. The ranch survived because of you, the accounts you repaired, the cattle decisions you made, the problems you solved before anyone else knew they existed. I want you to have a rightful share of Whitmore Ranch, not as payment, not as gratitude, because you earned it. Clara stopped reading. The room became quiet. Samuel looked away, giving her privacy. For years, she had wondered why her father never seemed to notice how much she did. Now she held proof that he had. Her eyes moved back to the page. At the bottom was his signature, a signature she knew, a name she trusted. Clara folded the letter carefully. What happens now? Samuel leaned back in his chair. That depends on whether you sign Margaret's agreement. Clara looked at the marriage contract, the paper that was supposed to remove her from the ranch. No. The answer came without hesitation. Samuel watched her carefully. You are certain? Clara placed her father's letter beside the contract. For the first time in a long time. That afternoon, Clara returned to the Whitmore Ranch. Margaret was waiting in that sitting room. She knew. Clara could tell by the way she stood. You spoke with Samuel. It was not a question. Clara removed her gloves slowly. Yes, and. Clara looked around the room, the furniture, the paintings, the family portraits. Everything in this house carried the Whitmore name, but somehow Clara had spent years feeling like a guest. Why did you hide my father's letter? Margaret's expression changed, only slightly, but Clara noticed. I don't know what you mean, you do. Margaret walked toward the fireplace. Clara, your father was sick. He made many plans. He made clear plans. The room grew colder. Margaret turned. You think a piece of paper changes everything? No. Clara held her gaze. I think it proves everything was already different. For the first time, Margaret looked uncertain. Only for a moment, then the mask returned. Even if you have a claim, what will you do? Stay here and fight with everyone? Clara looked down at this marriage agreement still sitting on the table. I won't be controlled. Margaret's voice softened. You are making a mistake. Maybe. Clara picked up the document, but it will be my mistake. Margaret stared at her. You don't know Ethan Calloway. No. Clara folded the paper. But neither did you. The silence between them lasted several seconds. Then Margaret spoke quietly. "You will regret this." Clara did not answer, because deep down, she already knew something. Staying would hurt. Leaving would hurt, but only one choice belonged to her. 3 days later, Samuel helped Clara finalize the legal documents, not the marriage agreement, the inheritance papers. The situation was complicated. The ranch ownership would still need further review, but Clara now had proof of her father's wishes. Enough to protect herself, enough to stop Margaret from making decisions for her. That evening, Clara packed a small trunk, not much, a few dresses, her father's letter, her account books, a small silver watch that had belonged to her mother. Everything else could stay. When Lillian found her near the stairs, she stopped. "You're really leaving?" Clara looked at her stepsister. For years, they had lived under the same roof but in different worlds. Lillian lowered her eyes. "I didn't know." Clara believed her. That was the hardest part. Because Lillian was not like Margaret, she was simply someone who had never been forced to see what Clara saw. "I hope you are happy," Clara said. Lillian looked up. "You mean that?" Clara nodded. "I do." The next morning, the wagon arrived. Ethan Calloway sat quietly on the driver's seat. Clara had only met him once before, at the church, but somehow seeing him again felt different. He stepped down carefully and removed his hat. "Miss Whitmore." She almost smiled. "You can call me Clara." A small pause. Then he nodded. "Clara." There was no warmth yet, no closeness, only respect, and somehow that felt like more than she expected. Ethan lifted her trunk. Clara reached for it. "I can carry that." He looked at her. "I know." The same answer. The same calm acceptance. After a moment, she let him take it. The road toward the mountains began before noon. As the Whitmore ranch disappeared behind them, Clara looked back once, not because she wanted to return, because she was saying goodbye. The mountains waited ahead, and somewhere beyond those snowy peaks was the man everyone believed was broken. Clara did not know him yet. She did not know his story. She did not know the quiet kindness hidden behind his silence. She only knew she was leaving one place where she had never truly belonged, and entering another where she had no idea what waited behind the door. The road into the San Juan Mountains became narrower with every mile. The tall grass of the valley disappeared behind them, replaced by thick pine trees, rocky slopes, and trails carved by wagons, horses, and years of mountain weather. Clara sat beside Ethan on the wagon seat, her hands resting quietly in her lap. She had expected him to speak more. Perhaps explain the cabin. Perhaps tell her what kind of life she was entering. But Ethan Calloway was a man of few words. He answered questions when asked. He did not fill silence just because silence existed. At first, Clara found that strange. At the Whitmore Ranch, silence usually meant someone was angry or disappointed, or waiting for her to make a mistake. With Ethan, silence seemed different. It was simply silence. The wagon climbed higher, the cold became sharper. Snow remained beneath the shadows of the trees, even though patches of brown earth showed where the winter sun had reached. After nearly 2 hours, Ethan slowed the horses near a small stream. "Rest here," he said. Clara looked around. "Are we close?" "Another hour." He climbed down carefully from the wagon. The movement was slower than most men his age, but there was no hesitation. He carried himself with the quiet stubbornness, as if he had already accepted the limits of his body but refused to let those limits decide who he was. Clara watched him check the horses. He adjusted a loose strap, checked the wheels, touched the harness where the leather had begun to wear. Everything was done carefully, nothing wasted. "You built this wagon yourself?" she asked. Ethan glanced back, repaired most of it. "Most? The original owner built the frame." Clara looked at the wagon. "You keep things working." His expression changed slightly. Things that matter are worth fixing. The answer stayed with her. She did not know why. Perhaps because she understood it. The rest of the journey passed quietly. By late afternoon, the trees opened, and Clara saw the cabin. It stood on a mountain slope overlooking a wide stretch of wilderness. It was not large. It was not impressive, but it was strong. Thick timber walls, a stone chimney, a small barn nearby, a fenced area for horses, a stack of firewood covered carefully beneath a wooden shelter. Everything had a place. Everything had been built by one pair of hands. Ethan stopped the wagon near the porch. This is it. Clara stepped down slowly. The wind moved across the mountain, carrying the smell of pine and smoke. For a moment, she simply stood there. This was the place where she would live. Not the Whitmore Ranch, not the house where she had grown up, not the rooms filled with memories of her father. This, Ethan carried her trunk inside. Clara followed. The cabin was simple, a wooden table, 2 chairs, a small iron stove, a shelf with a few books, a bed behind a curtain. Everything was clean, not decorated, not softened, but cared for. Clara walked slowly around the room. She noticed the details, the tools lined neatly beside the workbench, the coffee pot hanging above the stove, the folded blankets stacked beside the chair, the small repairs everywhere, a cracked shelf that had been reinforced instead of replaced, a chair leg carefully fixed, a cabinet door that no longer hung uneven. Ethan noticed her looking. It isn't much. Clara turned. I didn't say that. No. He looked away. But people usually do. The words were quiet. Clara understood more than she expected. She set her gloves on the table. I've lived in bigger houses. Ethan nodded. I know. The answer caught her attention. You know, everyone knows the Whitmore Ranch. She looked down. Not everything people know is true. Ethan looked at her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he walked toward the stove. I'll heat water. You don't have to. I know. Again. That answer. Clara almost smiled. Almost. The first night was not easy. There was no argument, no dramatic moment. Just 2 people trying to understand how to share a space that had belonged to one person for years. Ethan prepared a simple meal. Beans, bread, a little salted meat. Clara offered to help. He hesitated, then handed her the knife. Can you cut the bread? She looked at him. It was a small thing. But she noticed he had not told her what to do. He had not assumed she needed instructions. He had simply given her a place. They ate across from each other. The fire cracked softly. Outside, the mountain wind moved against the walls. After dinner, Clara washed the dishes. Ethan stood near the workbench repairing a broken lantern. You don't need to do that, he said. Clara dried a plate. I know. He looked up. A quiet understanding passed between them. For the first time that day, something almost felt natural. Later, Ethan showed her the sleeping arrangement. The bed is yours. Clara looked at the curtain. And you? I'll sleep by the fire. She frowned. That makes no sense. It's what I do. You've slept by the fire every night, most nights. Clara looked around the cabin. You have one bed, yes, and one person living here, until now. The words were simple, but they carried something neither of them addressed. Clara folded her hands. I don't want you giving up your bed because of me. Ethan looked at her. You just traveled all day, so did you. I've done it before. So have I. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Neither wanted to surrender. Not because they were angry, because both had spent years proving they could stand alone. Finally, Ethan looked away first. There are extra blankets, Clara nodded. Good. That night, Clara lay awake listening to the sounds of the cabin, the fire, the wind, the occasional movement of Ethan near the stove. She stared at the wooden ceiling. Her life had changed in less than a week. She had lost the home she knew, lost the place where she thought she belonged. And yet lying there in a stranger's cabin, she felt something she had not expected. Peace, not happiness, not yet, just peace. The next morning she woke before sunrise. Old habits, she dressed quietly and stepped outside. The mountain air was cold enough to wake anyone. Ethan was already there. He stood near the barn, checking one of the horses. "You always wake this early?" she asked. "Yes, why?" He looked toward the mountains. "Because the day doesn't wait." Clara understood that answer. She walked toward the barn. "I'll help." Ethan glanced at her. "You don't have to, I know." A small pause. Then, for the first time, Ethan smiled slightly, not much, just enough for her to notice. The morning passed with quiet work. Clara organized supplies inside the cabin. She noticed Ethan kept his tools in a way that made repairs easier. She rearranged nothing, she simply learned. When she found a loose board near the porch, she mentioned it. Ethan fixed it before lunch. When he noticed her riding boots had a worn sole, he said nothing. That evening, Clara found them repaired beside the door. She picked them up. The stitching was uneven in places, but strong. She looked toward Ethan. He was sitting near the fire, carving a small piece of wood. "You fixed these." He continued looking at the carving. They needed fixing. Clara ran her fingers over the repaired leather. "Thank you." Ethan nodded once. That was all. But later that night, after he went to sleep, Clara took his old saddle from the corner. The leather was cracked. The stitching near the side had started coming loose. She found a needle and thread, and by the light of the oil lamp, she carefully repaired it. She did not leave a note. She did not expect him to mention it. She simply placed it back where she found it. The next morning, Ethan noticed. He stood beside the saddle for several seconds. Then he looked toward Clara. She was pouring coffee into 2 cups. Neither said anything, but when she handed him one, his hand paused slightly before taking it. 2 strangers, 1 cabin, 1 fire, and somewhere between repaired boots and a fixed saddle, something small had begun to change. The days in Ethan Calloway's mountain cabin settled into a quiet rhythm, not an easy one, not yet, but a steady one. Clara learned the sounds of the place, the way the old wooden shutters rattled when the afternoon wind came down from the ridge, the way Ethan's boots sounded differently on the porch depending on whether he was carrying firewood, checking the horses, or simply walking back after a long day outside. She learned that he drank his coffee black every morning and always cleaned the cup immediately after finishing it. She learned that he sharpened his tools every Sunday evening, even if they did not need sharpening. Everything Ethan did had a purpose. Nothing was careless. It reminded Clara of herself. At the Whitmore Ranch, she had spent years doing the same thing. Keeping things working, keeping problems from becoming disasters, only nobody had ever thanked her for it. Here things were different. Ethan did not praise her every time she helped. He did not make a grand show of noticing. But he noticed. When she organized the supply shelves, he stopped searching for items he had misplaced. When she adjusted the way grain was stored in the barn, the horses wasted less feed. When she made a list of repairs needed before spring, Ethan read every line. He did not dismiss her ideas because she was a woman. He simply considered them. That alone felt unusual. One morning, while they ate breakfast near the window, Ethan placed a folded paper beside her plate. Clara looked down. "What is this?" "The supply list." She opened it. It was the list she had written 2 days before. He had added notes beside several items. Costs, quantities, possible places to buy them. She looked up. "You changed some things." "Yes. Why?" "Because you were right about the lumber prices." Clara paused. It was such a simple sentence, but she felt the weight of it. "Because you were right." She could not remember the last time someone had said those words to her. I didn't expect you to use my list. Ethan lifted his coffee cup. I didn't expect you to make one. A small smile almost appeared on her face. Almost. But Ethan noticed. And for a moment, the cabin felt warmer than the fire could explain. 2 weeks after Clara arrived, Ethan told her they needed to travel into town. We need supplies, he said. Clara looked at the list. Flour, coffee, lamp oil, nails, medicine, and a few parts for the wagon. She nodded. How long does it take? Half a day there, half back. Clara looked toward the mountains. She had not been to town since leaving Pine Hollow. A part of her wanted to avoid it. She knew how people looked at her. She knew the whispers, but she also knew she could not hide forever. The next morning, they left early. Ethan drove the wagon down the mountain trail while Clara sat beside him. The air was colder than the valley below. Snow covered the higher slopes, but the road was clear enough for travel. When they reached Pine Hollow, the town was busy. A wagon stood outside the general store. A blacksmith worked beside this road. 2 children ran past carrying a wooden hoop. People noticed Ethan first. They always did. Then they noticed Clara. The whispers began quietly, not loud enough to confront, just loud enough to be heard. That's her. The Whitmore girl, the one who married Calloway. Clara kept walking. She had spent years learning how to ignore people. But ignoring was different when the words followed you everywhere. Inside the general store, Ethan handed the owner a list. The storekeeper glanced between them. Didn't expect to see you here, Calloway. Ethan nodded. Needed supplies. The man's eyes moved toward Clara. And Mrs. Calloway? Clara answered before Ethan could. Yes? The man looked surprised. Then he forced a smile. Well, welcome to Pine Hollow. It did not sound welcoming. They purchased flour, coffee, lamp oil, nails, and several other items. The clerk wrote each item carefully on the receipt. Clara checked the numbers automatically. Ethan noticed. You still work even when shopping? She looked up. Old habit. I know. That answer again. She looked at him. You say that often. Ethan almost smiled. Because you often say things I already know. Before Clara could answer, a voice came from behind them. Well, this is something. They turned. Thomas Caldwell stood near the doorway. He looked exactly as Clara remembered. Clean coat, expensive boots, hair carefully arranged, the kind of man who never seemed touched by the hardships that surrounded everyone else. His eyes moved toward Ethan's cane, then toward Clara. So it is true. Clara felt Ethan become still beside her. Thomas. Thomas smiled, not kindly. I heard rumors. I didn't believe them. Believe what? Clara asked. He looked around the store. That you actually went through with it. The room became quieter. Several customers pretended not to listen. Clara held his gaze. It is my marriage. Thomas tilted his head. Of course, the word sounded polite. The meaning was not. I suppose we all make choices. Ethan stepped forward slightly, not aggressively, just enough. Thomas. The cattle heir looked at him. A faint smile crossed his face. Calloway, there was history there. Clara could feel it, not friendship, something closer to judgment. Thomas looked at Ethan's leg. Still managing that mountain property? Ethan's expression did not change. Yes, impressive. The word was meant to sound respectful. It did not. Clara placed the receipt on the counter. We should go. Ethan looked at her, then nodded. Outside, the wind had picked up. They loaded the supplies into the wagon. For a while, neither spoke. Clara could feel Ethan's silence. Not anger, something else. A familiar feeling. The feeling of being measured and found lacking. She turned toward him. Does that happen often? Ethan kept his eyes on the horses. What? People looking at you like that. A long pause. The answer was quiet. Clara looked away. She knew that feeling too well. They started back toward the mountain, but before they left town, they stopped at the small diner beside the general store. Ethan hesitated. "You don't have to." Clara looked at him. "Have to what? Sit there and pretend it doesn't bother you?" She studied him. "I wasn't pretending." He nodded. "All right." Inside the diner, they sat near the window. A waitress brought 2 cups of coffee. Clara noticed several people watching. One man at the next table whispered something to his friend. The friend laughed. Clara ignored it until the man looked directly at Ethan. Hard road running a ranch when you need a cane to walk. The table went quiet. Ethan lowered his coffee cup. He did not respond. Maybe he was used to it. Maybe he had learned that answering only gave people more power. But Clara had spent years watching people stay silent because they believed silence was easier. Not today. She placed her cup down. "Funny," the man looked at her. "What is? You seem very interested in his ability to work." The man shrugged. "Just stating facts." Clara looked toward the window. "Facts are things you know." She turned back. "Not things you assume." The man laughed lightly. "You defending him now?" Clara looked at Ethan, then back at the man. "Yes." The answer was simple. No anger, no raised voice, just certainty. The diner became silent. Ethan looked at her. Not because she had argued, because she had not hesitated. The man looked away first. After they left the diner, Ethan walked beside the wagon for a moment. Finally, he spoke. "You didn't need to do that." Clara stopped. "Yes, I did." He looked at her. She adjusted her gloves. People should not get to decide what someone is worth by looking at them. For several seconds, Ethan said nothing. Then he nodded. "Thank you." The words were quiet, but Clara heard them, really heard them. That evening, as they climbed the mountain road back toward the cabin, the sky turned orange behind the peaks. Ethan held the reins. Clara sat beside him. The distance between them was still there, but it was smaller, and Ethan Calloway, the man who had spent years believing nobody would choose him, carried one new thought back into the mountains. Someone had. The ride home from Pine Hollow was quieter than the ride into town, but it was not the same kind of silence. Before, Clara and Ethan had been 2 strangers sharing a wagon. Now, there was something between them that neither of them named. A small understanding, a moment at the diner, a defense spoken without hesitation. A thank you that had carried more meaning than either of them expected. As the wagon climbed the mountain trail, Ethan glanced at Clara once. She was looking ahead, watching the snow-covered peaks turn gold beneath the setting sun. She looked peaceful, but Ethan knew better than most. People could look calm while carrying heavy things. He had done the same for years. When they reached the cabin, they unloaded the supplies together. Clara carried the smaller sacks. Ethan did not tell her not to. That was one thing she had noticed about him. He offered help. He did not take control. That difference mattered. Over the next several days, the weather changed. The clear skies disappeared. Clouds gathered over the mountains, heavy and dark. Winter storms in the high country did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes they came quietly. A colder morning, a strange stillness in the trees, a sky that looked too gray. Ethan noticed the signs. He checked the barn roof twice. He brought extra firewood inside. He repaired the latch on the chicken coop before the wind had a chance to damage it. Clara watched him from the porch. "You expect trouble before it arrives." Ethan tightened the last screw on the gate. "The mountains usually tell you first." She looked toward the peaks. "And if you don't listen?" He stood and looked at the clouds gathering in the distance. "Then they remind you." The storm arrived the following morning. Snow began falling before sunrise. By mid-morning, the world outside the cabin had turned white. The wind pushed against the walls. The horses moved restlessly in the barn. Clara stood near the window holding a mug of coffee. The cattle fence on the north side still needs checking. Ethan looked up from the table. "I'll do it." Clara shook her head. "You have already been outside twice. I can handle it. So can I." The words were not sharp, just firm. Ethan looked at her. For a moment, neither moved. They both knew the argument. They were both used to standing alone. Finally, Ethan sighed. "Take the smaller trail," Clara nodded. "And you take the longer one?" He looked away. "I didn't say that." She almost smiled. "You didn't have to." Ethan reached for his coat. "Stay close to the fence line." "I know." He paused. A faint smile touched his face. "You say that often." Clara looked at him. "Because you often say things I already know." For a second, the storm outside seemed far away. Then they stepped into the cold. The mountain air cut through their coats. Clara rode the smaller path along the north pasture, while Ethan checked the lower fence. The snow grew heavier. At first it was manageable, then the wind changed. The trail she had followed that morning became harder to see. The trees blurred together. Clara slowed her horse. She looked back. Nothing, only snow. She pulled the reins gently. The horse shifted beneath her. She knew enough about the mountains to understand when the weather had become dangerous, but the north fence still needed checking. One more section, that was all. Meanwhile, Ethan returned to the barn. He removed his gloves and looked toward the mountains. Something felt wrong, not because he saw anything, because he did not. Clara should have been back. He waited several minutes. Then he reached for his coat. The storm was getting worse. He knew exactly what it meant. He also knew Clara was not the kind of person who turned around because something became difficult. That was one of the things he admired about her. It was also what worried him. Ethan saddled his horse. The pain in his injured leg increased in the cold. He ignored it. The trail disappeared beneath the snow. He followed the direction of the fence line, calling her name whenever the wind weakened. "Clara." Nothing, only the sound of the storm. He kept going. Every step reminded him of the accident years ago, the mountain, the snow, the feeling of being unable to reach someone who needed help. He pushed the memory aside. This was not then, this was now. After nearly an hour, he saw something near the trees, a horse, standing alone. Ethan's heart tightened. He rode closer. "Clara!" This time he heard an answer. "Shint." "But there, I'm here." He followed the sound. Clara was near a fallen tree, her coat covered with snow. She was sitting against the trunk, keeping herself protected from the wind. Her horse stood nearby. "I told you to stay close to the fence," Ethan said. His voice was harder than he intended. Clara looked up. He stopped. She was not arguing. She was cold and tired. He climbed down carefully. "Can you stand?" She nodded, then tried. Her boots slipped slightly in the snow. Ethan reached out, not pulling, just steadying. After a moment, she found her balance. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her. "For what?" "For making you come out here." The answer surprised him, the storm, the cold, the danger. And somehow, she was worried about him. "You think I came because I had to?" Clara did not answer. They rode back slowly. When they reached the cabin, Ethan helped her inside. The fire was still burning, but the room felt colder than usual. Clara sat near the stove while Ethan prepared warm water and dry blankets. Neither spoke much. The storm filled the space between them. Later that night, Clara woke briefly. The fire had lowered. Ethan was sitting nearby, still awake. "You should sleep." He looked over. "So should you." She watched him for a moment. "You were afraid." The word surprised him. He looked toward the fire. I was concerned. Clara studied his face. You don't have to pretend with me. The room became quiet. Finally, Ethan spoke. When I found you out there, I remembered something. She waited. Years ago, I spent a night on that mountain searching for men who never came home. His hand tightened slightly around the edge of the chair. I spent a long time believing that if I had been stronger, faster, better, things would have ended differently. Clara looked at him. Ethan. He shook his head. People see this. He touched the side of his injured leg. They see what I lost. The fire cracked softly. They don't see what happened before. Clara waited. She did not rush him. That was something Ethan noticed. Most people filled silence because they were uncomfortable with it. Clara allowed it to exist. Finally, he said, I knew what Margaret was doing. Clara went still. What? When your stepmother sent the agreement, I knew. The room seemed to shrink. You knew she wanted me gone, Ethan nodded. I knew she wanted someone to take you away from the ranch. Clara stared at him. Then why did you agree? He looked at the fire. Because I understood. The answer was quiet. I knew what it felt like to have people decide you were no longer useful. Clara looked down, and you thought I needed saving? No. His answer came immediately. No. Ethan looked at her. I thought you needed a place where nobody would ask you to prove you deserved to exist. Clara did not speak. For years, she had heard people tell her what she was worth, but no one had ever said anything like that. The storm continued outside, but inside the cabin, something changed, not suddenly, not completely, just enough. Two people who had spent years protecting themselves had finally shown each other the places where they were still hurting, and neither of them turned away. The next morning, the storm had passed. Snow covered the mountain in a blanket of white. Clara stood on the porch with a cup of coffee while Ethan repaired a broken section of fence. She watched him for a long time. Then she walked down the steps. I'll help. Ethan looked over. You don't have to. She held out the tools. I know. This time Ethan smiled. A real one, small but real, and for the first time since arriving at the mountain cabin, Clara felt that she was not simply staying there. She was becoming part of it. The change was not something anyone else would have noticed. There was no grand moment, no announcement, no single day when everything became different. It happened quietly, in the small things. A second cup of coffee waiting beside the stove each morning. A place for her coat beside the door. A wooden hook Ethan built near the kitchen wall because he noticed she always searched for somewhere to hang her apron. The cabin was still the same cabin. The mountains were still cold. The work was still difficult. But Clara no longer felt like a visitor. She felt like someone who belonged. Ethan changed too, not in ways that would have been obvious to strangers. He was still quiet, still careful with his words, still the man who preferred fixing a broken fence to sitting around a fire talking about himself. But Clara began noticing the small differences. He asked her opinion before making decisions about the ranch. He saved the better portion of coffee beans for mornings when he knew she had worked late. He stopped apologizing whenever his injured leg slowed him down. That last one mattered most, because Clara had realized something. Ethan did not need someone to feel sorry for him. He needed someone who saw him, and she did. One afternoon, several weeks after the storm, Clara was organizing the storage room when she noticed an old wooden box pushed behind a stack of blankets. She pulled it forward carefully. Dust covered the top. It looked like it had not been touched in years. Ethan? He was outside repairing a fence post. A moment later, he stepped inside. What is it? She pointed toward the box. I found this. Ethan looked at it. For a second, something changed in his expression. Not fear, Not exactly. Recognition. I forgot that was there. Clara brushed the dust away. Is it yours? Some of it. She lifted the lid. Inside were old receipts, land records, a few letters, and several documents tied together with worn string. Clara immediately noticed the careful way Ethan watched her. Something wrong? No. The answer came quickly. Too quickly. Clara looked at him. Ethan looked away. She did not press, not yet. Instead, she carefully removed the papers, one by one. Most were old ranch records, supply receipts, tax notices, nothing unusual. Then she found a folded envelope. Her name was written on the front. Not Ethan's, not Margaret's, hers, Clara Whitmore. Her breath stopped. Ethan stepped closer. I don't know what that is. She looked at him. You didn't put this here? He shook his head. No. The room became very quiet. The only sound was the wind moving around the cabin walls. Clara opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter. The handwriting was familiar. Her father's. She sat down slowly. For a moment she could not read, not because the words were unclear, because seeing his handwriting after so many years felt like hearing a voice from a room she thought was empty. She unfolded the page. My dear Clara, if you are reading this, then something happened that prevented me from giving this to you myself. I hope you know that every day I watched you work, every decision you made, every problem you solved. You believed people only saw your usefulness. I want you to know I saw much more. The ranch was never carried by one person. But after I became sick, it was your hands that kept it standing. The cattle numbers, the accounts, the repairs, the choices that saved us during difficult seasons. You did those things because you cared, not because you wanted praise. I intended for you to inherit your rightful share of Whitmore Ranch. You earned it. Clara stopped reading. Her fingers tightened around the paper. Ethan quietly stepped away. He did not ask what it said. He did not interrupt. He simply gave her space, the way he always did. Clara continued. Margaret may disagree. She may believe a woman's value is measured by marriage or appearance, but I know better. A strong heart does not need permission to matter. Remember that, your father, Thomas Whitmore. The letter lowered slowly into Clara's lap. The cabin was silent. She had imagined this moment many times, learning the truth, finding proof, discovering she had not been invisible. But now that it was real, it did not feel like victory. It felt like grief, because she had spent years believing something that was never true. Ethan sat across from her. Your father knew. Clara nodded. He knew. Her voice was quiet. He knew everything. Ethan looked towards a window. Then why didn't you? She looked at the letter. Because someone decided I shouldn't. The words carried no anger, only exhaustion. For years, Clara had accepted every criticism, every comparison, every moment when someone made her feel like she should be grateful just to have a place at the table. Now she held proof that she had always belonged there. The next morning, Clara rode into Pine Hollow with Ethan. They needed Samuel Reed to examine the documents. The ride was quiet, but it was not the old silence. Ethan glanced toward her. You all right? Clara looked toward the mountains. No. A pause. Then she added, but I will be. Ethan nodded. That was enough. Samuel's office was warmer than the last time Clara had entered. A small fire burned in the stove. Papers covered his desk. He read the letter carefully. Then he looked at Clara. Your father was very clear, so it is valid? Samuel adjusted his glasses. It appears so. Clara released a slow breath. But appearances are not enough. Samuel nodded. Your stepmother may challenge it. I know. Ethan stood near the window, silent, but present. Samuel looked between them. Whatever happens next, you will not face it alone. Clara folded the letter carefully. She placed it inside her coat. On the way home, they stopped near a small creek where the horses could rest. Clara sat on a fallen log. Ethan stood nearby. For a while, neither spoke. Then Clara said, "I spent my whole life trying to prove I deserved a place." Ethan looked at her. "You don't have to prove it here." She looked up. "Why?" His answer came simply, "Because you already have one." The mountains stretched around them, cold, quiet, endless. But for the first time, Clara did not feel like someone who had been sent away. She felt like someone who had finally arrived. Back at the Whitmore Ranch, Margaret stood in the office holding a letter from Samuel Reed. Her expression changed as she read the words. Clara had found the documents. The truth was no longer hidden. Margaret folded the letter slowly. Outside, Lillian watched her mother from the doorway. For the first time, she saw something she had never seen before. Fear, not because Margaret had lost control, because she was about to lose the story she had spent years creating. And the woman she tried to remove from the ranch was coming back, not as the unwanted daughter, not as the forgotten worker, but as someone who finally knew her own worth. The road back to the Whitmore Ranch felt different than the road Clara had taken weeks before. The mountains behind her no longer felt like a place she had been sent. They felt like home. Ethan rode beside her, his horse moving steadily through the cold morning air. The winter sky stretched wide above the valley, and the snow along the trail reflected the pale sunlight. Neither of them spoke much. They did not need to. Clara held her father's letter inside her coat. She had read it many times since finding it. Not because she doubted the words, because she needed to remember them. The woman who left the ranch had spent years trying to convince others she deserved a place. The woman returning now understood something different. She had never needed permission. When they reached the Whitmore Ranch, the old wooden gate stood exactly where it always had. The same fence, the same barn, the same wide fields where Clara had spent countless mornings checking cattle before the sun rose. But something felt different. Maybe it was her. The ranch hands noticed first. They stopped their work as the wagon approached. A few exchanged looks. Nobody expected Clara to return with Ethan Calloway beside her. Ethan guided the wagon through the gate and stepped down. Clara followed. She looked across the property. For years, she had walked these grounds carrying responsibilities nobody saw. Today, she walked them carrying the truth. Inside the main house, Margaret was waiting. Of course she was. She stood in the sitting room wearing a dark green dress, her posture perfectly straight. Lillian stood near the window. She looked nervous. Clara noticed. She also noticed something else. Lillian no longer looked away. Margaret's voice remained calm, almost welcoming. That was what made it dangerous. "You came back." Clara removed her gloves. Margaret looked toward Ethan. "And you brought him." Ethan said nothing. He simply stood beside Clara. Not in front, not behind, beside. Margaret noticed. Her expression tightened slightly. "I assume Samuel has been speaking with you." "He has, and he has filled your head with old papers and promises." Clara looked at her. "No." She reached inside her coat and removed the letter. "My father did." The room became still. Margaret's eyes moved to the paper. For the first time, Clara saw uncertainty. Only for a second. But it was there. "You don't understand what you are doing." Clara looked around the room, the furniture, the portraits, the walls that had held years of family history. "I understand more than I did before." Margaret stepped closer. "Clara, you are making this harder than it needs to be." "Hard for who?" The question was quiet, but it stopped Margaret. Lillian lowered her eyes. The truth had always been present. It had simply been easier not to look at it. Margaret folded her hands. "You think owning part of this ranch will make people respect you?" Clara looked at her. No. She paused. I think respecting myself should have come first. The words surprised even Clara, because they were not words she would have spoken months ago. Margaret studied her carefully. Then her gaze shifted toward Ethan. This man has convinced you of things. Ethan's expression remained calm. No. Clara answered before he could. He did not convince me. She looked at Ethan briefly. He listened. That was all. But Margaret understood, because listening was something she had rarely offered Clara. A sound came from outside, a wagon arriving. Thomas Caldwell stepped into the doorway moments later. He removed his hat. His eyes moved around the room, then settled on Clara. Is something wrong? Margaret recovered quickly. Nothing that concerns you. But Thomas looked at the papers in Clara's hand, then at the tension in the room. He was not a foolish man. He knew when something had changed. Lillian, his voice softened. What is happening? Lillian looked at her mother, then at Clara. I think Clara was treated unfairly. Margaret's expression hardened. Lillian, but for once Lillian did not immediately obey. I mean it. The room went quiet. Clara looked at her stepsister. She had expected many things: anger, denial, excuses. Not this. Lillian stepped forward slowly. I should have asked questions. Clara said nothing. I knew you worked harder than anyone. Her voice became quieter. I just never thought about why. Clara looked down, because sometimes the hardest apologies were the ones that came after years of silence. Before anyone could say more, Thomas cleared his throat. I came to discuss the marriage arrangement. Margaret looked relieved. A different problem, a distraction. My daughter and Thomas will be joining the Caldwell and Whitmore families. Tom looked uncomfortable. About that, Margaret turned. What? Thomas glanced toward Clara. I was told certain things about this ranch. The silence returned. What things? Margaret asked. Thomas hesitated. That Clara had no claim. Nobody moved. Clara watched his face. He looked less like a wealthy cattle heir now, more like a man realizing he had been given only half a story. Margaret stepped forward. Thomas, this is not the time. But he shook his head. No. He looked at Clara. I think it is. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees, the same wind that had surrounded Clara when she first left. Only now she was standing exactly where she had once been, told she did not belong. Thomas looked toward Margaret. You told me the ranch was secure. It is. Because Clara kept it secure, Margaret said nothing. That silence answered enough. Later that afternoon, Samuel Reed arrived with additional documents. The legal review would take time. There were records to examine, ownership details to confirm, questions that needed proper answers. But one thing was already clear. Margaret could no longer quietly remove Clara from her own inheritance. As the sun began to set, Clara walked outside toward the barn. Ethan followed. You all right? She looked at the ranch. I thought coming back would feel different. Different how? She thought for a moment. I thought I would finally feel like I won. Ethan leaned against the fence beside her. And Clara looked down at her hands. I don't. The answer was honest. The ranch was still the ranch. The years were still gone. The words people had spoken could not be taken back. Ethan nodded. Winning doesn't always fix what happened. She looked at him. No. A pause. But having someone stand beside you helps. Ethan looked away, almost embarrassed by the compliment. Clara noticed. She smiled faintly. A few weeks earlier, she would not have imagined making him uncomfortable. Now she knew him better. They stood there quietly, as the last light disappeared behind the mountains. The fight was not over. Margaret still had influence. The legal battle was still coming. The town would have opinions, but something important had already changed. Clara had returned, and this time she was not asking anyone if she was allowed to stay. But returning to the Whitmore Ranch did not mean the past had disappeared. The days after Clara came back were filled with questions. Some people in Pine Hollow believed her, some did not. In a frontier town, news traveled quickly, faster than wagons, faster than letters. By the time the sun had set twice over the valley, nearly everyone had heard that Clara Whitmore had returned with documents claiming a share of the ranch, and nearly everyone had an opinion. At the diner near the general store, men lowered their voices when Clara walked in. At the blacksmith shop, conversations stopped for a moment when Ethan entered. Clara noticed. So did Ethan, but neither of them reacted. They had both spent too many years letting strangers decide how they should feel. One morning, Clara stood in the Whitmore office reviewing old ranch records with Samuel Reed. Papers covered the desk, receipts from cattle sales, tax records, letters from suppliers, old agreements signed by her father. Samuel adjusted his glasses as he looked through the documents. Your father kept better records than most ranch owners. Clara touched the edge of one page. He believed every number told a story. Samuel smiled slightly. He was right. Across the room, Ethan stood near the window. He had been there for nearly an hour, not interfering, just watching. Clara noticed. You can sit down, you know. Ethan looked over. I'm fine. She raised an eyebrow, a small habit she had developed since knowing him. The look usually meant she did not believe him. Ethan noticed. You learned that from me? Probably. For a moment, the seriousness of the room disappeared. Then Samuel cleared his throat. There is another matter. Clara looked back at him. What matter? Samuel glanced toward Ethan. The mountain man became still. I have heard some talk in town. Clara frowned. About the ranch? Samuel shook his head. About Ethan. The room changed. Clara looked at Ethan. He looked away. Samuel continued carefully. People are asking questions about his past. What kind of questions? The usual ones. Samuel folded the papers. People see a man living alone in the mountains with an injury, and they create their own stories. Clara's expression tightened. That is not their right. No, Samuel said. It is not. Ethan moved away from the window. This isn't important. Clara looked at him. It is if people are judging you without knowing the truth. Ethan did not answer. That bothered her more than if he had argued, because she knew that silence. It was the same silence she had carried for years, the silence of someone who had grown tired of defending themselves. That evening, they returned to the mountain cabin. The ride was quiet, but Clara could feel something was different. Ethan was farther away than usual, not physically, something else. When they reached the cabin, he went straight to the workbench. He removed his coat, set down his gloves, started repairing a broken lantern. Clara watched him. You do that when something bothers you. Ethan kept working. Do what? Fix something. A pause. Then he looked up. I've always fixed things, not like this. The room became quiet. Outside, snow moved softly across the ground. Finally, Ethan set the lantern down. You heard what Samuel said. Yes, there isn't much to tell. Clara waited. She knew by now that pushing Ethan only made him close himself off, so she stayed quiet. After a while, he sat down. When I was younger, I guided people through these mountains. Clara listened. Miners, hunters, families moving west. He looked toward the fire. I knew every trail. The fire cracked. Then one winter, a group of miners became trapped after a storm. Clara's expression softened. Ethan, he shook his head slightly. Don't, not harsh, just a request. She stopped. I went after them. His voice remained steady, but the conditions were worse than expected. He looked down at his hands. I got them out, a pause. Not without losing something. Clara understood. His leg, the injury that everyone saw, the thing people used to measure him. What happened afterward? Ethan gave a small, humorless smile. At first, people called me brave. Clara looked at him. At first, then time passed. He looked toward the window. The company moved on. The town moved on. The words were simple, but they carried years. People stopped asking about the men I helped. His fingers rested on the table. They only asked about the man who came back injured. Clara felt something tighten inside her, because she knew what it meant to have one part of yourself become the only thing people saw. You thought they forgot who you were. Ethan looked at her. I think they never really knew. The answer was quiet. Clara stepped closer. Not too close, just enough, I know. Ethan looked surprised. You do? She nodded. Because people did the same thing to me. The room went still. They saw my size before my work. She looked toward the fire. They saw what I wasn't before they saw what I was. Ethan said nothing, but he understood. Was the difference between them and everyone else. They did not have to explain every wound. They recognized them. The next morning, Clara found Ethan outside the barn. The old saddle sat on the fence post, the same saddle she had repaired weeks before. He was cleaning it carefully. You never told me. Ethan looked up. Told you what? That you saved those men. He shrugged. It doesn't matter. It matters. He looked away. Why? Because you think it does not count unless someone remembers. The words stayed inside her. She did not say them. Instead, she picked up a loose strap beside him. You should replace this. Ethan looked at the strap. I can fix it. Clara smiled slightly. I know. For a moment he looked almost amused. Then he handed it to her. A small gesture. But it meant something. He was letting someone help. That evening, Martha Bell stopped by the cabin with fresh bread and a jar of preserved apples. The older widow had lived nearby for years and had known Ethan longer than almost anyone. She noticed the difference immediately. You look less like a ghost, Ethan looked at her. Martha, she smiled. And you, she turned toward Clara. You finally got him talking. Clara laughed softly. I don't think anyone can make Ethan do anything. Martha placed the bread on the table. No. She looked at Ethan. But someone can remind him he is worth listening to. Ethan looked down. He had no answer. Later that night, after Martha left, Clara sat beside the fire. Ethan sat across from her. The silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt comfortable. You know, Clara said, when I first arrived here, I thought everyone in this valley saw you as broken. Ethan looked at her, and now she looked toward him. Now I think they were wrong. A long pause. Ethan lowered his eyes. You should be careful. Why? Because believing in someone is a dangerous thing. Clara smiled faintly. Maybe. She looked at the fire. But so is spending your whole life believing you are less than you are. Outside, the mountains stood silent beneath the night sky. The world still judged them. The town still whispered. The fight over the Whitmore Ranch was not finished. But inside the small cabin above the valley, two people who had spent years feeling unwanted were slowly learning something neither had expected. They were not healing because the world finally accepted them. They were healing because they had found someone who already had. But outside the mountain cabin, the world had not changed as quickly. The snow began melting along the lower trails, revealing patches of brown earth beneath the white blanket. Spring was coming to the San Juan Mountains, but with it came a storm that had nothing to do with the weather. The dispute over Whitmore Ranch had reached Pine Hollow, and this time Clara Whitmore was no longer standing quietly in the background. She was standing at the center. The notice arrived on a Tuesday morning. Samuel Reed brought it himself. Clara was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing cattle records when she saw him riding toward the cabin. Ethan was outside repairing a section of fence. When Samuel entered, he removed his hat and placed a folded document on the table. The hearing has been scheduled. Clara looked at the paper. When? 2 weeks. The cabin became quiet. Ethan leaned against the wall. What happens then? Samuel looked at him. The court will review the inheritance documents, the ranch records, and Margaret's claim. Clara looked down at the papers. For years, she had worked with numbers, figures, receipts, contracts. She had always trusted facts, but this was different. This was her life. Samuel sat across from her. Your stepmother has hired someone to represent her. Clara was not surprised. Of course she has. Samuel nodded. She will likely argue that you left voluntarily and abandoned your responsibilities. Ethan's expression hardened. But she didn't. Samuel looked at him. I know. Clara placed the document beside her father's letter. Then we show the truth. Samuel nodded. Yes. The next 2 weeks passed quickly. Every day Clara prepared. She gathered the ranch ledgers, old receipts, payment records, letters from suppliers, documents showing repairs and cattle sales. Everything she had kept over the years, Ethan helped where he could. He carried boxes, organized papers, checked dates. He never told her what to do. He never tried to take over. He simply stood beside her. One evening, Clara found him sitting at the table after she had gone to sleep. A stack of records sat in front of him. He was carefully reading every page. She stopped in the doorway. You don't have to do that. Ethan looked up. I know. She smiled slightly. You really like saying that. He looked back at the papers. You really like doing things yourself. She could not argue with that. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and clear. Pine Hollow looked different that day. People gathered outside the courthouse, not because they knew the answer, because they wanted to see it. The Whitmore name had mattered in that valley for years, and now the woman many had ignored was challenging the family that carried it. Clara stepped from the wagon wearing a simple dark dress, no expensive jewelry, no attempt to impress anyone. Ethan stood beside her. His cane touched the wooden steps as they walked toward the courthouse. Some people watched him, some watched her, but neither looked down. Inside, the room was crowded. Samuel sat beside Clara. Ethan sat behind her. Margaret sat across the room with her attorney. Lillian sat beside her mother. But she looked different, quieter, less certain. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The hearing began. Margaret's attorney spoke first. He described the Whitmore Ranch as a family property, a property that needed stability, a property that required proper management. Then he looked toward Clara. Miss Whitmore left the ranch willingly. Clara remained still. She entered into a marriage agreement and moved away. Samuel stood. She was pressured into that arrangement. The judge looked at him. Do you have proof? Samuel placed documents on the table. We do. One by one, the records were presented. The marriage agreement, the inheritance documents, the letter from Clara's father. The ranch records showing Clara's involvement. The room remained quiet as the evidence was reviewed. Then Margaret's attorney spoke again. Even if Miss Whitmore contributed to the ranch, that does not mean she was the rightful decision-maker. Samuel looked toward Clara, then back at the judge. That is exactly what we are here to determine. The judge reviewed the papers. Mr. Whitmore clearly intended his daughter to inherit a share. Margaret's expression tightened. Her attorney leaned forward, but intentions are not always enough. Samuel nodded, which is why we have the financial records. The next documents were placed forward. Years of receipts, cattle sales, repair costs, supplier agreements, records Clara had maintained. The judge looked through them carefully. These accounts are unusually detailed, Samuel answered, because Clara Whitmore kept them. A murmur moved through the room. The judge looked toward Clara. Is this your work? Clara stood. Yes, sir. For how long? Since I was old enough to help manage the ranch office. And why? Clara paused. Because the answer mattered. It needed to be done. The judge studied her. Did anyone ask you to? Clara looked down briefly, then answered honestly, no. The room went quiet. She continued, I did it because my father built something worth protecting. Bah. Ethan watched. He knew that answer, because he knew Clara. She had never worked for praise. She worked because she cared. Margaret's attorney stood. Miss Whitmore, is it true you are now married to Ethan Calloway? Yes, and is it true you moved to his property willingly? Clara looked at him, after I was presented with no other choice. The attorney raised an eyebrow. No other choice? Clara remained calm. I was told my future depended on leaving. Margaret looked away. The attorney continued. Are you suggesting your stepmother forced you? Clara looked toward Margaret. I am saying she made sure I believed I had no place there. The courtroom became silent. Then Ethan stood. Samuel looked surprised. Ethan only looked at the judge. I would like to say something. The judge nodded. Ethan stepped forward slowly. The room watched. The man people called broken. The man people whispered about. I was told Clara Whitmore was being sent to me because nobody else wanted her. The room became still. Clara looked at him. Ethan continued. But that was not what I saw. His hand rested on his cane. I saw someone who understood hard work. Someone who cared about a place even when that place did not care enough about her. He looked toward Clara. I did not lose anything by marrying her. A pause. I gained a partner. No one spoke. Even Margaret had no answer. The hearing continued for another hour. More records were reviewed. More questions were asked. By the end of the afternoon, the judge requested additional time to review the documents before making a final ruling. The decision was not immediate, but something had already happened. The story people had repeated for years had changed. Clara was no longer the woman who had been sent away. She was the woman who had kept the ranch alive. Outside the courthouse, the spring wind moved through Pine Hollow. Clara stood on the steps. She expected to feel victorious. Instead, she felt tired. Ethan noticed. You all right? She looked toward the street. I thought proving the truth would make everything feel better. He waited. But it doesn't. Ethan nodded. Sometimes the truth arrives after the hurt. Clara looked at him. You always know what to say? He almost smiled. No. A pause. Usually I just know when to listen. For a moment, Clara said nothing. Then she reached for his hand. Not because she needed support, because she wanted him to know he had someone beside him too. The final decision would come soon. The ranch was still uncertain. But for the first time, Clara did not feel like she was fighting alone, and that was something Margaret Whitmore had never understood. A person who knows they are alone can be controlled, but a person who knows they are loved cannot be easily moved. The words stayed with Clara long after they left Pine Hollow. The court's final decision came 3 days later. Samuel Reed delivered the news himself. The judge had reviewed every document, every account, every record, every letter, and the conclusion was clear. Clara Whitmore had a rightful claim to her father's ranch. The papers Margaret had hidden could no longer be ignored. The property dispute was settled. The truth had finally been placed where everyone could see it. But when Clara heard the news, she did not celebrate. She simply sat at the kitchen table in the mountain cabin and held the letter from her father in both hands. Ethan stood near the stove, watching the fire. You won. Clara looked up. I suppose I did. He noticed the way she said it, not with happiness, not with pride, just with exhaustion. Samuel had expected relief. The townspeople expected satisfaction. Margaret had expected anger. But Clara felt something else, a quiet emptiness. The battle was over, but the years before it were still gone. The mornings she spent working without recognition. The dinners where she sat quietly while Margaret praised Lillian. The moments when she wondered if there was something wrong with her, because she had never been chosen first. A piece of paper could restore her inheritance. It could not return those years. That evening, Clara walked outside alone. The mountains stretched around her, dark and endless beneath the evening sky. The snow was beginning to melt near the cabin. Small patches of grass appeared through the white. Life returning, slowly, quietly. She stood near the porch steps until the cold reached through her coat. Ethan found her there. He did not ask why she was outside. He simply brought another blanket and placed it around her shoulders. Clara looked at him. "You always do that." "Do what?" "Fix things." Ethan glanced toward the mountains. "I know how to repair fences." She smiled faintly. "That isn't what I mean." He was quiet. Clara looked down at the blanket. "When I was at the ranch, I thought if I worked hard enough, people would finally see me." Ethan leaned against the porch railing. "They should have." She shook her head. "No." He looked at her. She took a slow breath. "I spent years waiting for other people to decide I mattered." The wind moved through the trees. "I should have known before they did." Ethan did not interrupt. He never rushed her. That was one of the reasons she trusted him. "I thought coming back would prove something." "Did it?" Clara looked toward the valley. "I don't know." A long silence followed, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence shared by two people who no longer needed to fill every empty space. After a while, Ethan spoke. "When I first came to this mountain, I thought being alone was easier." Clara turned toward him. "I understand." He nodded. "I didn't have to explain myself." His eyes moved toward the cabin. "I didn't have to hear what people thought." Clara waited, but after a while I realized something. "What?" Ethan looked at her. "A quiet life is not the same as a peaceful one." The words settled between them, because Clara knew. She had lived in a full house and still felt alone. Ethan had lived in an empty cabin and felt the same different lives, same loneliness. The next morning, they returned to the Whitmore Ranch. Not for a fight, not for a hearing, just to begin sorting what came next. The ranch looked different now, not because the buildings had changed, because Clara had. The ranch hands greeted her openly. Men who once avoided conversation now stopped to ask her opinion about cattle. The old foreman, Henry Mason, removed his hat when she approached. "Miss Whitmore." Clara smiled. "Henry." He looked toward Ethan. "Mr. Calloway." Ethan nodded. The respect between them had changed, not because Ethan had become someone different, because people had finally learned who he already was. Inside the office, Clara opened her father's old desk, the same desk where she had spent countless nights reviewing numbers. She ran her hand across the wood. For years, she had sat there believing she was only borrowing the space. Now she understood. It had always been hers too. A knock came at the door. Lillian stepped inside. Clara looked up. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Lillian closed the door. "I wanted to apologize." Clara remained quiet. Lillian looked down. "I should have noticed." The words were difficult for her. Clara could see that. "I should have asked why you were always working." She swallowed. "I should have known something was wrong." Clara looked toward the window. "You were young. That doesn't excuse it. No anger, no bitterness, just honesty." Lillian stepped closer. "Mother always told me you were difficult, that you were unhappy because you were jealous." Clara looked back at her. "And now?" Lillian shook her head. "Now I think you were tired." That answer surprised Clara. because it was the first time someone had described her pain instead of blaming her for it. "I am sorry," Lillian said. Clara studied her, then nodded. "Thank you. It was not forgiveness for everything. Not yet. Some wounds needed time. But it was a beginning." Later that afternoon, Clara and Ethan rode back toward the mountain cabin. The trail was familiar now, the turns, the streams, the tall pine trees, the same road that once carried Clara away from everything she knew. Now it carried her home. When they reached the cabin, Ethan stopped near the porch. Clara looked at him. "What is it?" He reached into his coat and removed a small folded paper. She frowned. "What is that? Something I should have given you earlier." She opened it carefully. Her eyes moved across the page, a land document, a small parcel of land near the cabin. Her name was written on it. Clara looked up. Ethan. He looked uncomfortable, almost more uncomfortable than when people questioned his injury. "I bought it before the wedding." "Why?" He looked toward the mountains. "Because I didn't want you coming here believing you had nowhere else to go." Clara looked back at the paper. "You knew? I knew Margaret was sending you away." His voice softened. "I wanted you to know this place was yours if you wanted it." The paper trembled slightly in her hand. All her life people had told her what she could lose, her position, her home, her place. But Ethan had quietly given her something different, a choice. Clara stepped closer. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she folded the paper carefully and held it against her chest. "You really do fix everything." Ethan looked at her. "No." A small smile appeared. "Not everything." The evening light fell across the mountains. The cabin stood behind them, small, simple, but no longer lonely. Clara looked at the man beside her. The man everyone had called broken. The man who had given her the one thing she had searched for her entire life. A place where she did not have to earn belonging. A place where she was already chosen. And for the first time, the silence around them did not feel empty. It felt like home. Months passed slowly in the mountains. Not the kind of slow that meant nothing was happening. The kind of slow that allowed things to grow. The kind of slow that came with planting seeds, repairing fences, rebuilding trust, and learning the small habits of another person. The mountain cabin was no longer the same place Clara had entered on that cold afternoon when she first arrived with a single trunk and a life she thought had already been decided for her. The walls were still made of timber. The stone chimney still carried smoke into the Colorado sky. The old wooden floors still creaked beneath their boots, but the cabin had changed. A small table now sat near the window where Clara kept her account books. A shelf held jars of dried herbs and preserved vegetables. A woven blanket rested over Ethan's chair beside the fire. Flowers grew near the porch when spring finally reached the higher valley. Small things, but each one carried a story. Each one showed that someone lived there. Not a lonely mountain man hiding from the world. Not a woman who had been sent away. A home, their home. The Whitmore Ranch continued under Clara's careful management. She traveled there several times each month, reviewing the accounts, speaking with the ranch hands, and making decisions about the cattle. The same people who once ignored her now waited for her opinion. Not because she demanded respect, because she had earned it long before anyone decided to give it. Henry Mason, the old foreman, often stopped by the office with reports. One morning, he placed a stack of papers on Clara's desk, the spring cattle numbers. She opened the report. Better than expected. Henry nodded. Your father would have been proud. The words made Clara pause. Years ago, she would have lowered her eyes. She would have wondered if she deserved to hear them. Now she simply smiled. Thank you, Henry. Outside the office window, Ethan stood near the corral. He had become a familiar sight around the ranch. Some people still noticed his limp. Some people still noticed the cane. But fewer people saw only those things anymore. They saw the man who taught younger ranch hands how to read the weather, the man who knew every mountain trail, the man who could repair almost anything with patience and a steady hand. His injury had never disappeared, but it no longer defined him. One afternoon, a young ranch hand named Caleb struggled with a horse that refused to cooperate. The animal pulled back nervously. Caleb grew frustrated. Ethan approached slowly. "Don't fight him." The young man looked over. "What should I do? Listen first." Caleb relaxed his grip. Ethan showed him how to slow down, how to let the horse trust him. After a few minutes, the animal settled. Caleb smiled. "I thought you couldn't work with horses anymore." Ethan looked at him. "Who told you that?" The young man looked embarrassed. "I heard people say things." Ethan glanced toward the mountains. "People say many things." Then he walked away. Clara watched from the porch. She knew that answer, because she had lived it too. People talked, people judged, but neither of them lived by those voices anymore. Later that week, Lillian came to visit. She arrived alone in a small wagon, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. Clara welcomed her inside. "You came a long way," Lillian smiled. "I brought supplies from town." She removed jars of jam, fresh bread, and a small package of coffee. Clara laughed softly. "You didn't have to." "I know." The answer surprised Clara. Then Lillian smiled. "I suppose I learned that from you." They sat near the fire. For a while they talked about ordinary things, the weather, the ranch, the coming summer. Then Lillian became quiet. "I think about things differently now." Clara looked at her. "About what?" "About the way I lived before." Lillian looked down at her hands. "I thought being admired was the same as being valued." Clara listened. "I thought because people smiled at me, they respected me." She looked toward the window, "But you were the one everyone depended on." Clara said nothing. "I should have seen it." There was sadness in Lillian's voice. Not self-pity, regret. Clara reached across the table. "You were young." Lillian looked up. "That doesn't change what happened." "No." Clara paused. "But it can change what happens next." The two women sat quietly. The past could not be rewritten, but maybe it did not have to control the future. That evening, after Lillian left, Clara stood outside watching the sunset. Ethan joined her. "You two talked a long time." Clara nodded. She apologized. Ethan looked toward the valley, and Clara thought for a moment. "I believed her." He nodded. That was enough. The years of hurt were not erased, but forgiveness did not always mean forgetting. Sometimes it meant choosing not to carry the weight anymore. As summer arrived, the mountain property grew, not into a wealthy estate, not into something grand, something better. A place people knew they could stop when traveling through the mountains, a warm meal, a dry place to rest, a person willing to help. Miners passing through the valley stopped there. Ranchers visited for advice. Families traveling west found shelter during storms. The cabin that once held only one person's silence became a place filled with voices. One evening, Clara sat on the porch with Ethan. The valley below glowed with small lights from distant homes. She held a cup of coffee between her hands. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Ethan looked at her. "The church?" She nodded, the whole town watching. He smiled slightly. "I remember. I thought everyone was waiting to see me fail." Ethan looked out toward the mountains, and now. Clara looked around. The porch, the cabin, the land, the man beside her. "Now I think they were wrong." A quiet smile appeared on Ethan's face. "They usually are." She laughed softly. The sound surprised them both, because laughter had not always been easy for either of them. But now it came naturally. The sun lowered behind the peaks. The same mountains that once represented Uncertainty had become the place where they found peace. Clara reached into the drawer beside her chair. She pulled out the small land document Ethan had given her months before. She still kept it safe, not because she feared losing the land, because she remembered what it meant. A choice. A home no one could take away. "You really bought this before we married?" Ethan nodded. "I wanted you to have something that belonged only to you." Clara looked at him. "You know what is strange?" "What? At the Whitmore Ranch, I had a name, a house, and a family." She looked toward the cabin. "But here I finally have a home." Ethan did not answer right away. He simply reached for her hand. The gesture was small, quiet, just like everything important between them. Years later, people in the valley would tell stories about the mountain rancher and the woman who came to him as a stranger. They would talk about how the man everyone called Broken built one of the strongest homes in the valley. They would talk about how the woman everyone underestimated became one of the smartest ranch owners in the territory, but the truth was simpler. Neither of them had been saved by becoming someone else. They had been saved by finally being seen. The world had called Clara unwanted. The world had called Ethan damaged. But together, they built something the world could not measure: a life, a family, a place where two people who had spent years standing alone finally had somewhere to belong. And high above the valley, beneath the endless Colorado sky, the little mountain cabin stood warm against the evening wind. Not as a hiding place, not as the place of loneliness, but as a home built by two people who had finally found each other. Years before that cabin became a place of warmth, it was only a quiet room in the mountains, carrying the weight of two people who believed they had already been forgotten. Clara arrived believing she was being sent away because she was not enough. Ethan lived, believing his scars and his injury had taken away the parts of him that mattered. But somewhere between shared fires, repaired boots, and quiet moments when words were not needed, they discovered something neither of them expected. If you had stood where Clara stood, leaving behind the only home you knew, wondering if anyone would ever truly choose you, would you have recognized the kindness waiting on the other side of that lonely road? And if you had carried Ethan's pain, hiding the parts of yourself you thought the world would reject, would you have believed that someone could still see your worth? Their story reminds us that love is not always found in perfect lives or easy beginnings. Sometimes it arrives through patience, loyalty, and the courage to let another person see who we truly are. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments. What moment made you believe Clara and Ethan were meant to find each other? And if you enjoy stories of love, healing, and second chances, consider subscribing. There are many more unforgettable journeys waiting for you in the stories ahead.